Hello and welcome back to Pagan Ireland, on to Chapter 3. Let us try now to realize what the country was like before the coming of Christianity. What we learn about the early times of paganism will, in the main, remain true of the habits of the people for many centuries after. In fact, till the coming of the Northmen and the Normans taught them other ways of life. For though the introduction of Christianity, a monastic system peculiar to these countries, was introduced which profoundly modified the conditions of life, it took the form of an adaptation of the old system to new wants, so far as outward things were concerned, rather than of an entire reorganization. Of native growth, the church organization was formed to native lines, and adapted itself easily and naturally to the circumstances of the nation. Ireland in early times, before the coming of the Northmen, was very different in appearance to what it is at present. A large portion of the country was covered with forest, and even many parts that are now chiefly bogland were then dense woods. The cutting down of the forests has been a great misfortune to Ireland. The surface of the country consisted either of wood, bog, or pasture land, with many portions given up to cultivation. There were no towns with houses and streets, but only settlements and cleared places amongst the forests or on the seacoast. Up to the time of the Northmen, Dublin was a mere group of huts on the banks of the Liffey, with a wooden bridge thrown across for travelers going north or south, whence the place was called Haclia, or the Ford of the Hurdles. Similar groups of simple huts or wooden buildings were at the same time to be found at the ports of Cork, Limerick, and Waterford, and each of these afterwards formed a nucleus round which the towns grew up. It was the Northmen who first used stone in the construction of large buildings, and whose stone towers, keeps, and churches laid the real foundation of the existing cities. At the time we speak of, the villages, placed in clearings of the forests, or gathered round the dwellings of large farmers, were mere collections of wattled huts of the most primitive kind. Land ownership. In the earliest times of which we know anything, the whole face of the land was open, unbroken by landmarks or fences, and we hear of the chariots driving right across country. The pasture lands were not divided up into fields, for very little of the land, if any, at first belonged to private persons, or remained long in the hands of one family. It was constantly being redistributed, so that it would have been useless to hedge it about in any way into separate farms. The country was divided up into tribes or clans, and the district on which a clan settled seems at first to have been the property of the whole clan, not of separate members of it. To each household was allotted a piece of ground, of which one part was wood, one bog, and one part fields or arable land, so that each might share the good and bad together. It was the duty of the family to cultivate the property and live upon it, but they might not part with it or sell it, except by consent of the tribe. The only land property they were allowed to sell seems to have been what they acquired as a reward for some other service or work of skill, or for some such reason, this which came to them in a different way, it would seem they might part with if they wished. When a family settled down on a piece of land, the members generally cultivated it together for the first year. Later, when the family increased, it was divided among them by lot after a certain time. Each chose his own portion, and the boundaries were fixed. It is uncertain whether even they could look upon it as their own in the same way as a landowner now thinks of his property, or whether it was still in part the property of the whole tribe. Even the chief does not seem to have actually owned any portion of the tribal land, except the immediate pleasure garden within the raths of his fort. Certain properties had in later times to be set apart for the support of the kings of Tara, from which they drew the sustenance of the royal household, and there was at one time a dispute between them and a king of Ulster about some lands in Meath, which had formed the royal patrimony of the kings of Ulster, so that probably the provincial chiefs followed the example of the High King in appropriating special estates to their private purposes. The chiefs also had control over the wastelands belonging to the tribe, and these they could allot as they pleased. Private property consisted not of land, but of cattle, goods, and household effects. These were a man's own, and he could give them away or exchange them as he thought fit. In the famous scene in which Ailill and Maeve, a king and queen of Connacht in prehistoric days, count up their several possessions to see which of them could boast of having the most, there is no mention of landed property, only of swine, cattle, droves of sheep, horses, ornaments and jewels, garments, mugs, vats, and household appliances. Land indeed was not thought of as valuable. There was more than a sufficiency for the small population. It was easy to get, and every family could have as much as it could cultivate. It was only when the households increased so much that land began to be sought after that they thought of fencing in their portions with walls or ditches and hedges. This, we are told, happened first in the reign of the sons of Eadslain, 658 to 694 AD, who lived well on Christian times. After this time, we may suppose that the cultivator's household had some definite ownership in his land. When the Normans came to Ireland, they being quite ignorant of Irish methods of land ownership, obliged the chiefs to take such an oath of fealty for their tribe's lands that they would have exacted from their Norman nobles at home. Probably the Irish chief did not understand one word of the oath that was being administered to him in a foreign tongue, and so he quite cheerfully swore away his tribal estates to the Norman king, receiving them back on military tenure. Had he understood, he could not possibly have sworn away what did not belong to him but to his tribe. This difference of system crops up again again and again in the course of history. At the time of the Norman invasions, probably both parties were equally ignorant that the other was thinking of something totally different to that which each had in their own mind. Riches then, in the early days, consisted not in land which could not be alienated or in money which did not exist, but in the possession of sheep and cattle, ornaments and household utensils, garments and weapons of war. It is necessary, if we would understand the importance attached to these things, to bear this in mind. Roads and bridges. At what time the first roads were made through the country we do not know, but the announcement in the annals that on the day of the birth of Khan of the 100 Battles, 177 AD, a number of great main roads suddenly sprang into existence leads us to conclude that there was a tradition that somewhere about his reign thoroughfares began to be made through the country. The old writings give us the name of quite a number of well-known and important main roads. The chief centers, especially Tara, had several roads leading up to them, so had the 6 hospitable houses of Ireland, of which we shall speak later, and probably there were roads leading to the places where the annual or triennial affairs were held. Bridges, even of hurdles, like the one at Dublin, seem to have been scarce all through the ancient period. They apparently did not know how to build them. We read of large armies wading through Boyne and the Shannon. The building of the first bridges for armies is noticed with great care in the annals, and we do not hear of it till well on in the Norse period. Even then, they were on light wooden structures, as is shown by the ease with which they were destroyed and the necessity there was constantly to renew them. The fords are often heard of in Irish story in connection with another purpose, namely the combat of single warriors, which seem to have always taken place close to the rivers or in the shallows. Sometimes the combatants seem to have actually fought in the water. The 5 provinces. The country was divided into 5 provinces: Leinster, Ulster, Connacht, Munster, and Meath, which was called Royal Meath because it formed the special estate of the kings of Tara. These provinces were not at first fixed. Munster was at the beginning divided into 2, and in fact through afterwards considered one province only. North Munster, or Thomond, was practically independent of South Munster, or Desmond, through the greater part of the history. The province of Meath was created later than the rest by a king called Tull, the legitimate, or the possessor, a monarch who restored the Milesian line in his person after its usurpation by some inferior tribes at about 130 AD. A great stone, still called the Stone of Divisions, stood and still stands at the place where the 4 provinces then met, and which was supposed to be the center of Ireland. The new province was formed by taking an equal piece around the stone for each of the other divisions. Tribes and clans. But besides the 5 provinces, which had their own kings, of whom the Ardrai, or High King of Tara, was chief, the country was further broken up into a multitude of clans or tribes, each having a chief of its own. This was a cause of perpetual warfare, for every powerful chief could aspire to add to his territories and possessions by making raids on his neighbors and carrying off cattle or booty. The largest part of an Irishman's life in early times was spent in such raids and petty wars. All the men were trained to war, and they were always ready to leave the more peaceful occupations of tilling the land and minding the cattle to join in a foray on a neighbor's lands. Especially between Ulster and Munster, and Ulster and Connacht, there was great jealousy and consequently constant fighting and bloodshed. Many of the raids were undertaken simply for the purpose of increasing the number of cattle possessed by the tribe. Some clans had not cattle enough to stock their lands, and the easiest way to get more was to steal it from another tribe, so that cattle raids were frequent. These raids, or tains, as they were called, gave rise to a number of romantic tales which the old storytellers loved to relate. The greatest story of Ireland is the raid made by a famous queen of Connacht named Maeve to carry off a wonderful bull called the Don, or Brown Bull of Culling, Cooley, County Louth, which belonged to a chief of Leinster. In this raid, all the hosts of Ireland were engaged for a whole winter, and they traversed all the north of the country from west to east. It was in this raid, or tain, that the hero Cuchulainn fought standing alone against all the forces of Erin, although he was only a youth and beardless. This story shows how much importance was attached to the possession of cattle in those old days. The value of everything was reckoned by its worth in cows. A slave woman was worth 3 cows, or 5 head of horned cattle. Tribute. Even the tributes to the chief were paid in cattle: sheep, hunting dogs, pigs, and horses, and in bondmen and bondwomen, for the Irish, like all other medieval nations, practiced slavery. The lowest class of the community were slaves, and were bought and sold like cattle. The captives taken to war added to their numbers, as they seem to have been made slaves of as a matter of course by their conquerors. Ornaments, such as rings and necklets, drinking horns, cauldrons, swords and coats of mail, cloaks, and near the seacoast, boats and ships, were also given in tribute in later times, and perhaps also in the pagan period. As there was no money, all transactions had to be made by the gift or exchange of goods. When a man had not enough cattle to stock his farm, it was the duty of the chief, who was generally rich in livestock, to loan or give him the animals he needed out of the cattle brought in tribute. These were paid to the chief's steward, who was called a Brugfer, and who lived in one of the hospitable houses, of which we shall speak afterwards. He had large farms and outhouses, in which the livestock brought in tribute were kept, but as it was of no use to a chief to possess more cattle than he had land to put them on, he loaned out these cattle to the small farmers, who generally possessed more land than stock, vassalage. But to receive stock in this way from the chief made the farmer the chief's man, and brought him under a sort of vassalage. He was then called heir seal, and he was obliged in return not only to render military service to his chief, but to assist in harvesting and agricultural work on his land. He was obliged also to give a certain fixed supply of food and refreshment whenever the chief made a visitation into his neighborhood, which the chiefs lost no opportunity of doing, for they and their followers were supported free from all charge during the time they remained, and it was a cheap way of living. The farmer might take much or little stock from the chief. If he took little, he was called a serkil, and remained a free man, with all of his tribal rights. At the end of 7 years, he ceased to be the chief's tenant, and the cattle became his own. He gave, in return, milk and the young of the animals to the chief, besides homage and manual labor, in other words, assistance, in the building of his fort or reaping of his harvest, instead of which he seems, if he preferred it, to have been permitted to follow the chief to war. But the Deerstock tenant sank into a lower position, and his duties and tributes were very heavy. He became a farmer of lower rank, and seems to have partly lost his freedom. The necessity for having cattle nevertheless induced large numbers to accept Deerstock, and this increasingly considered the power of the chief. No man was permitted to take stock from any chief but his own, as in that case he would have become the vassal to a chief of another tribe. Besides these vassals, the chief had even more power among another class of persons, who were called feuders, and who often owned no connection with the tribe, and no master but the chief himself. In those days, when disputes were frequent between the chief and his people, and between one member of the tribe and another, many persons or families were obliged to fly from their own tribe and people and take refuge in another tribe. Sometimes they fled to escape from punishment, sometimes perhaps to escape their debts. In one way or another, they had broken the tribal bond and had to depart in order to make for themselves a home among a strange tribe. We read of whole septs or clans sometimes moving from their tribal lands and settling elsewhere. The family or sept of the Deasy, who originally belonged to Meath, were expelled by Cormac MacArt and went into Munster, where they found a new home. But the feuders were generally criminals or broken men, and the chief of the territory in which they took refuge treated them with little respect or mercy. He generally allotted them portions of the wastelands belonging to the tribe, which were not allocated to any particular person, but were available for anyone who wished to use them, for it was to the chief's benefit to attract as many outlaws or wanderers as he could. The members of the tribe were almost independent of the chief, but the feuder was his slave, whom he could rack rent at pleasure, and command to do anything he chose. The more feuders the chief had under him, the more independent was his position, and the greater his wealth and power. These wandering tenants were naturally hated by the tribesmen, and they were indeed often of a low and despised class. Many of them were not even entitled, as were all the other tribesmen, to compensation for injuries done to themselves or their families. While, on the other hand, any injury done by the feuder was compensated by his lord and owner, he was himself an outlaw, and of no account. The highest classes of noble freemen next to the chief were the heirs, some of whom were wealthy through the possession of land and others through the possession of cattle. Each of these ranks was distinguished after the knowledge of dyeing had been acquired, by a difference in color of the dress. When they traveled, each rank was attended by a fixed number of servants or followers. Next to the chief, who had 12, came the different grades of the heirs or landowners, who had from 3 to 9. Their wives were allowed half the number, but they seem to have taken more than they were legally allowed. Queens ought, according to the rule, to have been satisfied with 6, but Queen Maeve never had less than 9. In this they only copied their lords, whose retinues became so large and burdensome that they had to be suppressed. It was an immense tax on their people to have constantly to receive and support such large companies, and this burden, which in later historic times was known as coshering, or coin and livery, was continued on in the 17th century or later.